But just moving on, let's kick off on what we mean by online learning. We've categorized this in two ways here, synchronous and asynchronous. So the focus really of this webinar is around live online learning, which we call synchronous. So where people learn live. This is a synchronous session, a webinar. It's us learning live together. Asynchronous is where people can learn the same materials but at different times. So let me just explain what I mean by that a little bit more. So synchronous sessions can be webinars, virtual workshops or virtual classrooms, which many of you may be familiar with. They could take the form of live quizzes or polling or live audio or video chat. There's a lot more forms of synchronous learning, but that's some of them. Asynchronous, you'll be familiar with some of this, online learning modules, screencasts or recorded videos, but asynchronous might also be discussion boards or accessing digital documents. That's the other form of learning, online learning that we're talking about here. And we're going to move on now. I'll hand over to Dario to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these different methods and how you might choose a different approach.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So, of course, sometimes people see some online learning module or another resource and they feel, okay, that's interesting, that looks good, perhaps we should use it for our learning purposes. But we always advise that that you should choose the approach to your content based on the audience that you have and also for your learning objectives. Each format has its advantages and disadvantages, and we'll cover that in a moment. And also you need to think about timelines. You need time for preparation of any learning event or program. Then the ways of reaching people, how you want to reach them, or how many resources and what resources are available for the development of that program or resource. And then one important thing, sustainability is another issue. Oftentimes people think about, okay, let's do something, but sometimes maintaining the program of learning or even learning resources is also something that one needs to think of in advance. So I'll start with just presenting briefly about asynchronous format. And when I talk about asynchronous format, I'm talking primarily about online learning modules. And I assume that some of you have seen, or many of you have seen, our learning modules. We have Cochrane Interactive Learning, which was the first suite of modules that we produced. It's about methodology of conducting systematic reviews of interventions. It's for authors. It's 11 modules, more than 12 hours of learning. It's quite extensive and covers that methodology. Cochrane Evidence Essentials is 4 modules aimed at consumers and users of evidence, and it covers topics like evidence-based medicine, clinical trials, randomized control trials, and systematic reviews and how to use them. So online learning modules, they are asynchronous, meaning that they are available on internet. You can access them anytime. You can learn in your own time. There is an active interaction between module and the learner. There are various assets and components that foster that interaction. It's possible to have formal assessment in that we have a set of questions, assessment questions at the end of the module, and you can get a certificate, which we actually do for interactive learning modules. Error proof, that means that you can check and double check and triple check if needed before you launch the module, so you're really sure that everything is in place as it should be, so that there are no errors and everything's accurate and so on. So that's an advantage. Of course, also there are no restrictions on numbers. You can put some restrictions if you like, but otherwise you can put it as an open resource, as we have with Evidence Essentials, and people can access and learn whomever from wherever and so on, wherever they have internet, of course. And then the modules and the activity of learners with the modules can be tracked and recorded. provided you have learning record store. That's a piece of infrastructure that allows that capturing of the data that coming about a learner's activity. That's also something that can be done with asynchronous learning. Disadvantages is that there's very limited or even no learner tutor interaction. So people interact with the program, with the machine, with the module, but there's in principle no interaction with either tutor or other learners. And of course, development costs are high, both in terms of time and in terms of actual costs in order to create proper, high quality modules. That's a costly and long process. When asynchronous learning or online learning modules should be selected for self-directed learning, when you aim for self-directed learning, when the content is something that you want to learners to learn in depth, when the learning content is extensive, if you want to access large audiences, that's another thing. And then online learning modules can be of different duration. It can be very brief, can be micro learning, to long courses that we have as interactive learning modules. They're built on e-learning platforms. Many of you will not be familiar with them. Some of them are Gomo or Adapt. We're using these two. Previous it was Articulate. Now we're not using that one, but there are others also. So these are e-learning platforms that are used for building online learning modules. And then moving on to synchronous learning, that's actually what we are covering mostly in our webinar today. And we are talking about live sessions, webinars, and virtual workshops. And this infographic shows our activity since we started the program of Cochrane Learning Live. That was since 2016. You see that the number of webinars is increasing up to now. I think maybe that this is 90th webinar. We've delivered 89 so far. We had more than 6,000 webinar attendees. And since we record most of our webinars and we make them available for later viewing, we also count the video views. So here's the number, 109,000 video views. So that's, I think, quite substantial. And the recent thing that we've started doing is our virtual workshops. In the last month or two, we run through 3 sessions, virtual workshops on the new conflict of interest policy. And in these 3 sessions, we had 51 attendees. So you see that the numbers are different, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So advantages of this type of learning is that you can have learner-tutor interaction. Development timelines are shorter, and the costs are also lower. Webinar recordings can be shared. We usually record our webinars, we share them in our webinar archive. Of course, virtual workshops, that's a bit more tricky. They may not lend itself for recording because it involves small group and so on, but webinars, definitely recordings are useful. And similar to asynchronous learning to online learning modules, attendance can be tracked and recorded in Learning Record Store. Though that's only attendance, whereas with online learning modules, you can actually track and record the learner's activity to much more greater detail, actually which pages they've accessed, which quizzes they took, and so on. Whereas with webinars, we just record attendance. Disadvantage, it's fixed time. So for those of you who were able to manage their time zones, they were able to join us today. Others, unfortunately, not. So that's one of the biggest problems, I would say, for synchronous, any type of synchronous live learning. Live presentations are sometimes, well, you can't avoid some errors. It's not always perfect. Usually it's quite okay, but sometimes you have glitches and mistakes. So that is one disadvantage, that you can't make sure that everything is absolutely perfect. Webinars are usually more passive, as you're perhaps experiencing yourself now. You're listening to me and perhaps, I don't know, thinking when will be the next interactive part, which is with webinars quite limited in terms of our opportunities for that. in workshops, it's better. You can actually plan and deliver more discussion and interactivity and activity of learners. Formal assessment is challenging. It's not so easy to set up a formal assessment in webinars. I can't think of a way we could do a formal assessment on this session. And of course, smaller learner numbers is something that you need to consider. It's different with webinars and with workshops. With webinars, you might have 100 or perhaps even a couple of hundreds, but not more than that. With workshops, that's much lower, perhaps a couple of dozen or 20, 30, something like that. So when to choose or select synchronous learning, and specifically webinars like this one today. If you have something to deliver in a lecture style, you run for 60 minutes. Don't worry, it shouldn't be a 60-minute talk, but the session is 60 minutes. You can use interactivities like questions and answers and polls. And if you aim for somewhat larger audiences, today we have 103 attendees. So that's a solid number for a webinar, I think. And when high level of interaction or hands-on learning is not essential. Example of this is when we ran our Introduction to New Cochrane Handbook webinar. It was very well attended. We had more than 200 people, and it was more or less awareness raising, talking through the new chapters, and yeah, it was Julian Higgins talking through that, and there was some questions about it, but basically not much in-depth learning or hands-on learning. With virtual workshops, it's a bit different. We usually plan for 60 or more minutes, 90-minute workshop. Probably we wouldn't go for more than that because it's hard to keep the attention of people, even though on workshops you do have more interactive elements like small group work, discussion, exercises, hands-on work. That all can be part of virtual workshop. And the reason is that we allow or a smaller group of learners. So up to 30, I would say, is a good number. And then you can actually engage everyone in one way or the other. And the purpose is to address specific topics, so to allow some discussions around topics or questions, or to develop specific skills. And one of the examples that we've ran was this conflict of interest policy for managing editors, managing editor, assistant managing editors. That was very focused on the content of that conflict of interest policy, but also on discussion on how to implement that new policy once it's launched in October. So yeah, we are now at the point where we can take any questions if you have any. Chris, do you see any questions?
At the moment. I just guess give it just a second in case anybody got any questions coming up. Okay, if there's no questions at this point, we will be stopping. Okay, I think it looks like something's come up. Let me take a look. Do we have any success in a poster session? This is from Sharon. Sharon, I'm assuming you're asking if we've run virtual poster sessions. That Dario, did you want to answer that about how we approach the virtual colloquium?
Well, yeah, poster sessions, that was part of our Santiago virtual colloquium. And we worked with presenters to produce screencasts of those posters and oral presentations. We uploaded them. It was part of our effort to basically salvage the colloquium in a way. And I think the main benefit of that was for presenters to basically get the opportunity to present that, but it's asynchronous because we've produced those screencasts and made them available. So after that, people can access it and watch at any time.
Thanks, Sharon.
So we have other questions. Assess the outcome.
Just actually,
Have you
Dario, just
assessed
as
it?
a
Go
follow-up
ahead.
from Sharon, actually, on any software options on that. Sharon, I can answer that quickly. I mean, when we ran the virtual colloquium, that was just run through our Drupal website. So we built that based on the existing, well, our web team built that based on the existing colloquium website. That's how we shared it there. I know there are virtual conferencing services that can run virtual poster sessions for you. I couldn't tell you specifically what they are. Sorry, Dario. Back to you for Lilia's question.
Assessing outcomes of the learning. That's well, we define learning outcomes in a way when we are creating the training, especially online learning modules, and assessing can go through learning through form assessment that we have at the end of the online learning modules. But actually, I mean, in terms of impact, it's with any learning, it's more difficult to get to actually whether our training eventually leads to better production or better quality systematic reviews in Cochrane authors. That's something that we still haven't got to in terms of assessing. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't say much more than that.